In the last video, I talked about how you can use ID and class selectors to get lists of elements or individual elements, and in this video, I'm going to talk about the query selector, which allows you to select elements based on anything that you want. So to get started, I just have this blank HTML file. We're loading in our script tag here with the defer attribute, just like before, and I have the website open up on the right and the console open up on the bottom right. So let's just add in a few divs. This first div, we're going to give a data attribute. So we're going to say data test. And we're just going to say this has a data attribute. There we go. Let's do another div. This one we're going to do with a class. So we're just going to say div class. And we're just going to say this has a class. I'm actually going to have two of these. If we save, you can see we have data attribute and then two of the things with our classes. And then let's just go a step further and say that we want an input, for example. And we're just going to give it type equals text. And we'll save. Now you can see we have our input here. So now, like I mentioned with query selectors, we can select an element based on absolutely anything. So let's just open up this script.js real quick. And in here, we need to select our elements using these query selectors. So to do that, we can just say document.query selector. And you're going to notice we have query selector and query selector all as our two available methods. They both work exactly the same, but query selector is going to return just one element, and query selector all is going to return an array of elements that match the specified selector. So let's just do query selector first, because we want to get one element. And what we want to do is we want to get the element with this data attribute, data test. So to do that, we just need to write the CSS selector to select that. So we know that CSS, to select a data attribute, you put it inside of brackets like this. And we can just write data test. This is going to select any element that has the data attribute data test. So we can just say const data attribute element is equal to that. And then we can just come down here, console.log data attribute element, click save, and you can see we have this data test element being logged down here as an individual element. If we were to instead use query selector all and pass it in this selector and save, you'll now see we get the thing called a node list, which works very similar to an array. And you can see it has that one div inside of it because there's only one element on our page that matches this selector. So for this, we're going to use query selector because it makes more sense to use query selector since we're trying to get one individual element. Now let's go ahead and select the elements that have the div class. So we can say const divs with classes is equal to document.query selector. And first, I'm just going to do query selector to show you how this works when you have multiple elements with the same class or the same selector. So here we can say to select something in CSS with a class, you just put a period in front of it, and we'll say div class. And now let's log out those divs with classes down here. If we save, you can see it selects the very first div out of the two. And that's because with query selector, it only selects one element and it always selects the very first one that it finds. In our case, that's this first div in the list, and this second div is just completely ignored. So if we wanted to get all of them, which in this case we do, we can do query selector all, click save, and now we have this node list of each one of these elements. And we can, for example, go ahead and change them. So we could say divs with classes.for each, and for each one of these, what we want to do is take our div, and we want to say div.style.color is equal to red, for example. And now we styled both of these as red. And you'll notice we were able to use this for each method. That's because node list has a for each method on it. It doesn't have all of the array methods though. For example, if we tried to do map, we're going to get an error. If we go to the console, you can see it says divs with classes.map is not a function. So again, if you want to use some of those more unique array methods that I showed you in that previous video, you may need to convert this to an array by just doing array.from and passing in divs with classes. This is going to work just fine for you. But in our case, since for each is part of the node list, we're able to do this with no worries, and you can see it changed these to red. Let's just also change our data attribute element style.color to be equal to green, just so we can see that that is also working. Now lastly, we're going to select this text element down here. So we can just say const input is equal to document.query selector. And we're just going to select for all input elements. In our case, we only have one input element, so we're using query selector. And we can come down and we can log that input. And if we hover over it, you can see that is properly selecting the input, and it's just selecting things based on CSS selectors. That's what this query selector does. You just pass it a CSS selector, You can make it as complex as you want. For example, we could say input that also has a type that's equal to text. Make sure we use single quotes in here. And now if we save, you can see again, it's still selecting the input because it's matching this entire selector. We can even go a step further and say that we want to select this input, which is directly inside of a body, for example. And again, it's going to select this because this input is directly inside of the body. So you can make this a huge, massive CSS selector, and as long as it matches, it'll go with this query selector here. Because of this incredible flexibility and the fact that you can use for each when you use query selector all, I almost always use query selector or query selector all to select elements just because I find it so much easier, and you can even select elements based on their class or ID using query selector and query selector all. And that's all there is to these query selectors. I recommend using them whenever you can if you need to select an element. In the next video, we're going to be talking about event listeners, which is how you can actually make your page able to be interacted with, which is by far the most useful part of JavaScript. I can't wait to see you in that video.